I'll move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Last week, during Right to Know Week, a lecture was given by a senior investigator at the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. It included a statistic that I found rather staggering. In 2017, the province of Nova Scotia received 2,285,000 information requests. That's an average of almost 9 requests every business day. The senior investigator compared that with Switzerland, where they only had 551 requests in 2017, and Switzerland, Mr. Speaker, has 8 times more the population of Nova Scotia. The senior investigator's conclusion is if people have free access to information, they don't make 2,285 requests. So will the Premier please acknowledge that Nova Scotia guards too much information unnecessarily?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She would also realize the numbers that she's been putting out there. I hope that senior person from the Information Office recognize that 82% of the requests that come in are filled within 30 days, Mr. Speaker. That's as high as it's ever been. We're going to continue to improve that and continue to make sure that those Nova Scotians who ask for information, Mr. Speaker, what we can give them, we'll give them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
The point is they shouldn't be asking in the first place. So the senior investigator continues to say that here in Nova Scotia, 14% of requests result in full disclosure. In Switzerland, that number is 55%. It further underscores just how reluctant this government is to share information with its citizens. And it speaks to the paradigm, the default position for information. And here, Mr. Speaker, the default is to hide until you are forced to reveal. Will the Premier commit to changing the philosophy of his government to one where the default is to disclose unless it is absolutely necessary to withhold?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would know, the FOIPOP officers throughout the departments respond to the requests that continue to come in. She would also know, Mr. Speaker, open data that we put out there so that Nova Scotians are using that data to create opportunity for themselves and businesses. She would also know that we put up a website so when a request comes in, not only do we send that information out to the person who asked for it, we actually put it live. Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to make sure that we continue to open up this province. And I want to remind the honourable member again, Mr. Speaker, 82% of those are done within 30 days, Mr. Speaker. That's the highest number this province has seen.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
And from what we hear from Nova Scotians, that's information that is not relevant to them. So this government, I know, likes to brag about everything the Premier just said, and it's easy to achieve when you don't take the time to give the applicants the information that they ask for. Again, from the senior investigator, Nova Scotia responds to applicants with, and I quote, no record return, 33% of the time. So that means one in 3 questions get nothing in response. And as we all know, in this House, most days, that's 0 and 15. So, will the Premier admit that these statistics indicate an unacceptable level of secrecy from this government?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, what it indicates, Mr. Speaker, is that when the honourable member and her party go on fishing trips looking for information, Mr. Speaker, that the government doesn't have any information related to, they don't give it to them. Would they prefer we made something up, Mr. Speaker? That's what former governments used to do. This government is open and transparent and will continue to be open and transparent, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear about something, Mr. Speaker. I've been in this House since 2003, and every party that sat on this side of the House has been asked to put together a health committee so that we could scrutinize the largest budget item in this province. That party said no, we're open and transparent, giving them the opportunity to scrutinize our largest budget item here. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, we're allowing the Auditor General, the independent Auditor General, to have his place here, and hopefully the opposition will take their duty seriously and show up next time.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Today we learned that the new hospital will be built using a design, build, finance, maintain P3 model. The evidence against the use of this model is so overwhelming. The schools the government built on this model cost the public $228 million to buy back. In
Order,
Ontario,
please. The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Ontario, the Royal Ottawa Hospital cost an extra $88 million to build using a P3. The Brampton Civic cost $200 million more to build on this model. In the face of all the evidence that's available, why in the world has the Premier decided to rely on private companies to design, build, finance and maintain the QE2?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. We compared, Mr. Speaker, what it would be if we continued to do the traditional build against what it is, Mr. Speaker, on a P3 project. The reports that the Honourable Member had referenced have been looked to through Deloitte, Mr. Speaker. They continue to bring back a recommendation to what would be the best value for the taxpayers of this province, Mr. Speaker, ensure that we could do it as quickly as possible. We've accepted that, Mr. Speaker. Portions of this related to the current footprint, the activity that would take place inside of those particular footprints. So, example, at the HI site on the 3rd and 5th floor, that will be done in the traditional build, but all of the new build on that particular footprint in Clayton Park will be done through a P3 model, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to ensuring that that project goes down the road so that Nova Scotians get the healthcare infrastructure they deserve, Mr. Speaker. It has gone through successive political parties who did not have the courage to stand up and answer the call and ensure that our citizens and our families had state-of-the-art facilities.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier can remonstrate about this till the cows come home twice. It does not change the fact that internationally there is great concern and criticism about the use of this model in projects, especially of hospital sort, because in these models the government loses control over the design. Under this model, the successful proponent is in control of the design, which will therefore not be in the hands of the people who know Nova Scotia health care best. Why would the Premier adopt a model for redeveloping the QE2 that will limit our control of the project's design?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly why we're doing the P3 model, Mr. Speaker. It is actually our health care providers who will help us put the design together, Mr. Speaker. And when we hand that design over to the P3 proponent, Mr. Speaker, we expect them to deliver on the amount they have delivered to us. The Honourable Member hits an important point. When capital projects have been built under successive governments, under every political party in this province, they have not come in on time or on budget. All the Honourable Member needs to do is go look at the Truro Hospital, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservative Party said they could build for $92 million, Mr. Speaker, and by the time they were done, it was doubled.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
There is a body of national evidence about this. DBFM P3 hospital projects, the Premier will know, have been significantly troubled in BC, have been very troubled in Ontario, and one of the serious problems with them is that on this model of hospital construction, the government loses the ability to adjust to healthcare changes in the future. As over that period of 30 years, as healthcare changes, it will be so much more.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It will be so much more difficult for us to adapt the model that is built because we won't own the infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, nobody thinks health care in Nova Scotia over the next 20, 25, 30 years is going to be the same as it is today. So why would the Premier lock us into a hospital redevelopment model that's going to tie our hands when it comes to making future health care changes?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish the NDP Premier had an opportunity to actually listen to the Honourable Member, because he's absolutely right. Healthcare is changing across our province, Mr. Speaker. Why does he want to be stuck in the past when it comes to our infrastructure? Our infrastructure needs to be modernized. It needs to reflect the reality of today and the next 50 years. That's why healthcare providers stood with us today talking about this important investment. A game changer was word by Dr. Bethune, Mr. Speaker. It was Dr. Bethune and the people down at the Dixon Centre who said, we need to put the cancer care on this particular site because it matters to patients and it will talk about the future. That's exactly why we've adopted this model. It's exactly why we're going to continue to move forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Premier. Judicial independence is one of the pillars of our justice system and our democracy. The concept says that our courts should not be subject to improper influence from the other branches of government or from private or partisan interests. I don't think it's difficult to understand why it is crucial that this separation exists. Those who interpret the laws ought to be clearly separate from those who write the laws. So will the Premier recognize the work and independence of the Chief Judge Appointment Advisory Committee?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure which appointment she's referring to, but the judiciary is independent from government, Mr. Speaker. They continue to make recommendations as we move forward, and we're going to continue to make sure that we work with them as a separation. I'm very proud, Mr. Speaker, that the bench, the Provincial and Family Court now reflects Nova Scotia more than ever has before. Gender parity, minority representation, first Indigenous judge, Mr. Speaker, first member of the LGBT community is a member of that body, and we're going to continue to work with them to ensure that they keep their independence, Mr. Speaker, but that they actually reflect the population at large.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, I understand that Mr. J. Michael Macdonald, Chief Justice of Nova Scotia, recently resigned as Chair of the Chief Judge Appointment Advisory Committee, and I understand that his resignation came in the form of a letter. Will the Premier table the resignation of Chief Justice Macdonald today and tell the House the reasons for his resignation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe the letter was sent to me, Mr. Speaker, but I'll check to find out if it was. I'd be happy to share it with you. Be very happy to tell you that we're very pleased that Family Court Judge Pam Williams has continued to stay in her role as Chief Judge, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to continuing to work with her. I want to tell you it's been under her leadership and that of Judge Halfpenny Macquarie that we opened the Gladue Court in Cape Breton. We're continuing to ensure her leadership, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with her. She's sitting on the board around restorative justice for the Home for Coloured Children, Mr. Speaker. Those are the kinds of things that we need to continue to make sure that we work with our judiciary so that more Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, see themselves reflected in these institutions.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Ambulance offload times at our regional hospitals are rising. In fact, not one of our regional hospitals met the offload standard of 20 minutes 90% of the time this year. At times, paramedics are backed up for hours waiting to transfer patients into the care of the hospital. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell us when regional hospitals will be meeting these provincial standards?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, work is and has been ongoing to investigate and identify means to improve the offload process, Mr. Speaker, to improve the ambulance offload times and address this very concern. I've mentioned to the members here, Mr. Speaker, in the past the successful work that's been done at Dartmouth General to improve these offload times. Despite an increase of about 22% in emergency visits by ambulances at that site, they actually maintained or possibly even slightly improved their offload performance over the last year based upon those changes.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in its last evaluation of the Nova Scotia Health Authority, Accreditation Canada noted that serious issues with patient flow, including the presence of alternate level of care patients in hospital beds, were contributing to emergency department bottlenecks. In a news article today, an NSHA staff person confirms that this issue is a direct result of the high number of people waiting in hospital beds for long-term care placements, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, can the minister confirm that he will open new long-term care beds to address this problem?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it's recognized that this is a complex problem. We see the effects through the emergency departments and with these offload times for the paramedics that are looking to have their patients transitioned directly into the hospital. Mr. Speaker, our hospital and healthcare system is an integrated system, and each part depends on the others. What I can tell the members that over the past number of years, we've reduced the number of people waiting in the hospital for long-term care. We've reduced the amount of time those people who are waiting in the hospital for long-term care are waiting. And Mr. Speaker, we've already announced that we're going to be adding additional long-term care beds in the Cape Breton region.
The The honourable member for Colchester-Musquedabbit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. I don't know how people think up this stuff, but they do. There's a new vaping product out called Juul, J-U-U-L, and it started to be sold now in Canada in September. And I'll table that information. I mean, smoking Juul has become a fad in the U.S., and of course, they're calling this now an epidemic by the healthcare officials. The Juul is a USB stick size which contains the equivalent nicotine of 20 cigarettes and can be easily consumed in a day. Will the minister confirm whether or not that's even being sold now in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thought my colleague was talking about the question that they had presented for him. Mr. Speaker, I'm not familiar with the product that my colleague references, but if he's prepared to share that information with me, I'll certainly look into that for him.
The honourable member for Colchester-Musquedabbit Valley.
No, it's just the stuff that people create. I don't know how they do it, but anyway, Juul pods, they allow for a faster and smoother absorption of nicotine, so that you can have a much higher concentration of it and not feel that burning effect in the throat. It has rainbow-colored lights and comes in flavors, like cotton candy and peanut butter and jam. So it's particularly appealing to young people. So, Mr. Speaker, as you can imagine, the Canadian Cancer Society is against this product. So will Nova Scotia be a leader and use regulation to ensure safe levels of nicotine should this product come to Nova Scotia for consumption?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't sure if my colleague was talking about Christmas or the usual activities in a daycare in the morning. Mr. Speaker, on a serious note, important that we recognize the point my colleague is making that high levels of consumption of nicotine could be harmful. I'll certainly take whatever information my colleague has and, working with the Minister of Health, determine the substance to this particular issue and if it is even available here in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my question through you is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, on September the 26th, I asked the minister about a woman whose kidney was a match with her brother. Despite this, she was worried that her brother would die while waiting for the transplant. Mr. Speaker, since then, another desperate family has come forward. Heather Jo Macdonald is a match and willing to donate her kidney to her dad, Sidney Joe, but they are anxiously waiting to hear when the operation will occur. So my question again to the minister is, will the minister tell us how long the wait list is for live donor kidney transplants?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's safe to say that no member of this legislature can truly appreciate the significance of the situation that the members has brought forward here unless they're going through a situation like that. I can't say for sure how long the individuals may be expected to wait. As I looked into this the last time the member raised this question, Mr. Speaker, I was explained that there are a lot of variables that come into play for both the prospective donor as well as the prospective recipients, that there are various clinical parameters, their health and wellness and so on. So there are a lot of variables that can affect how long someone may be waiting to complete that surgery.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate what the minister said, and there's no question that there are variables that take place, but the people that I had talked about before were waiting almost 2 years. Heather Jo Macdonald says there hasn't been any communication from the health authority about her dad's kidney transplant since July. Mr. Speaker, that's a long time to wait. It's a long time to wonder, and it's a long time to worry. It's a terrifying waiting game where her dad's life weighs in the balance. So the question for the minister is, Will he concede that the NSHAO should communicate more frequently and openly with families like Heather Jo Macdonald's when it's about a transplant and a life-threatening situation?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, on two fronts, I'd like to respond to the member's inquiry. On the first, the specific instance, I would ask that the member provide the information that he has so that I can follow up on the specific case situation. But then more broadly, indeed, with respect to the communication and the flow of communication, what that process is for all Nova Scotians that may be in a similar situation to ensure the communication is more efficient, more effective. So I will certainly endeavour to look into that, which would be more of the system side of this particular situation.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members on this side of the House have repeatedly asked the Minister of Health to attend rallies during this session. But so far, none of us have been successful in enticing him to join us, Mr. Speaker. The Minister misjudges us if he thinks stonewalling us will get us to stop asking. Nova Scotians want their voices to be heard. They're afraid, and they want the Health Minister to hear what they have to say. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask one more time. Will the Minister of Health come to Cape Breton on October 14th to attend a rally in Waterford? And, Mr. Speaker, I think I've heard every answer so far in this legislature except yes or no.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member raising and bringing to the floor of the legislature the concerns of his constituents with respect to the future of healthcare services in his community and indeed the broader Cape Breton region. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we share those concerns. We recognize and heard from Cape Bretoners the concerns about the delivery of healthcare, the frequent closures of emergency rooms, Mr. Speaker. We went out with our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority. We inspected and evaluated the infrastructure that's currently in place. I determined that some of that infrastructure has passed its useful life, Mr. Speaker, for future expansion of healthcare services, and that's why we made the decision to invest in new primary healthcare services and expansions at Glace Bay and Cape Breton Regional.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Well, I guess, Mr. Speaker, I hadn't heard them all. There was another new one today. Mr. Speaker, I understand the minister's a busy man. Maybe October 14th doesn't work for him. But there must be a day soon that he can take a few hours to hear from Cape Bretoners. All the minister has to do is name the date and the time, and we'll make a meeting happen for him. So will the minister commit today to arranging a date and a time to meet with Cape Bretoners, or will he finally admit that he just doesn't want to hear from them?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I believe I may have mentioned this previously, but contrary to statements made by members opposite with respect to the announcement that was made in Cape Breton back in June, I did meet with people from Cape Breton. I met with physicians, Mr. Speaker. I met with municipal and First Nations representatives, Mr. Speaker, to hear from them, indeed, even on that afternoon itself of that announcement, Mr. Speaker. But every meeting that I take, Mr. Speaker, isn't always in front of cameras.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health, and just to follow up, I don't know one person from my community that was at any of those meetings to discuss. Mr. Speaker, last May, the Department of Health, announced that it would fund a new high-dose flu vaccine to protect seniors from the virus and reduce hospitalizations. While the standard flu vaccine is available to all Nova Scotians, this new formula will only be covered for people living in long-term care facilities. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain why no other groups were considered for this coverage?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member bringing this question forward. It's a great opportunity to remind all members, indeed all Nova Scotians, of the importance and the value of getting vaccinated for flu season, Mr. Speaker. What the member has brought forward is the high-dose flu vaccine, Mr. Speaker, far more a stronger version. This particular version of the vaccine has been identified for particularly vulnerable populations, and the most vulnerable populations population, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia. We were reviewing this last year. Our seniors in long-term care facilities, vulnerable in part based upon their age and suppressed immune systems, but also living in a facility with many other individuals. That's why that was the population that was targeted for this expansion.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Funny enough, though, not all seniors who are living in long-term care facilities are the only ones that require it. In fact, this government's focus on home care and keeping seniors in their homes longer, which we're reminded of daily. So I'm confused as to why the department hasn't considered to defray the costs for those seniors with compromised immune systems to improve the vaccine. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to covering flu zone for everyone with a serious immune condition over the age of 65?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a relatively new vaccine. It is the first time that we are rolling it out in our province. We will continue to monitor the effects that this new vaccine has on, again, what has been identified as the most likely or most vulnerable population. That would be those living within long-term care facilities, because it's not just about the age and suppressed immune systems in that environment, but indeed also the fact that they are living in an environment in close proximity, Mr. Speaker. So it's a combination of factors that led to us choosing this particular population. We will evaluate and see how the vaccine performs and consider any potential future expansions after we see the results.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. In the major loss to Bedeque and surrounding areas, Dr. Emily Beaton informed Victoria County Memorial Hospital of her decision to leave just after 2 years. Now table that, Mr. Speaker. Citing issues with her contract and an unstable work environment, she will now take her talents to Prince Edward Island. We've heard similar stories with 2 doctors leaving Digby because they weren't receiving what was promised by the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Perhaps the Nova Scotia Health Authority could have taken Dr. Beaton out to dinner to discuss her situation instead of looking out for themselves. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, to avoid any future confusion over contracts, why does the Minister not stick to the master agreement that was agreed to by Doctors Nova Scotia when issuing contracts to potential recruits?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's question. I think in his preamble, he forgot to mention the new physician that started work in his community. A physician, one of the first to come through our immigration stream, Mr. Speaker, in partnership. So I think that's important for the member to let his community know about the success of these programs and initiatives that we've taken place. With respect, Mr. Speaker, the contract, he's confusing 2 different sets of contracts. There's a master agreement which sets out the compensation frameworks for physicians, but indeed, Mr. Speaker, individual physicians as independent businesses, Mr. Speaker, they enter into individual contracts on top of the master agreement.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, Nova Scotia has a doctor shortage, and Bedeque still has 1 doctor short. Nova Scotians can take little comfort that in the last few weeks there have been 2 high-level departures from the recruitment departments at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. The Nova Scotia Health Authority can promote our surf, lobster and coastlines on their website all they want. But the reality is, when you're working over 100 hours a week, there's not much time to take in those activities. PEI is similar in that they can offer surf, lobster and the coastlines, but they also pay $100,000 more to their doctors, according to Doctors Nova Scotia. So my question to the Minister, how does he expect to compete and recruit more doctors to Nova Scotia when doctors can work less, make more money and have a better quality of life just a few hours away?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with all due respect, I think my colleague, the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture, would agree that the lobster in Nova Scotia is far superior to that they could find in PEI. But, Mr. Speaker, with respect, Mr. Speaker, to the compensation side of things, the data that's been cited and used is a couple of years old, coming it's a couple of years old, coming from a report, Kai-High data, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't take into account the nearly $40 million that we invested in improving the compensation available for family physicians, providing comprehensive family care to Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, that data is a bit out of date for the member.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've risen on this topic a number of times in the past, and that's kidney disease and access to treatment. There's a group in Barrington Passage been looking for a satellite hemodialysis unit in that community. Right now, the closest option is for them to drive 54 minutes to Yarmouth, or more than an hour away to Liverpool. And the space, if the space isn't available in Yarmouth, that drive gets even longer. There are 14 people in Shelburne County right now having to travel to service in Yarmouth. So my question to the Minister of Health, can he commit to creating a satellite hemodialysis unit in Barrington Passage for patients in that area?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do recognize the member's concern. As he noted, he has brought it to the floor. I believe even some correspondence that we've shared on behalf of his constituents. Mr. Speaker, I really don't think I can fully appreciate, nor can any of us, unless you know someone who goes through dialysis treatment. It takes a significant amount of time, even if it is located nearby, because you're actually in a chair for, I believe, somewhere in the vicinity of 4 hours a day to receive treatment. Mr. Speaker, we're not at this time in a position to expand to that community, but what the members should know, and all members know, is that we have been investing. We're expanding in a number of communities. There are expansions underway. We need to get those across the line, Mr. Speaker, to improve and reduce the transportation time for people receiving care. I think it's over 40 seats that we're adding to the system across the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, there are 14 people in Shelburne County alone who have to travel to Yarmouth County in order to receive that service. There's a pocket of people who need the service of full dialysis rather than home dialysis, so they can't really transfer in. And Mr. Speaker, I can say that the Yarmouth service is actually almost to capacity, so some serious decisions are going to have to be made. A friend of mine, Artie Smith, who lives in Woods Harbour, is getting to the end of his rope, and he says he can't function because of the time it takes out of his day and out of his week in order to do it. And that need continues as our population ages and the instances of other comorbidities keep rising. Can the minister outline what needs or conditions are required for a community to receive consideration for a satellite hemodialysis unit?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Part of the review, rather than on individual community advocacy or individual one-off situations. It's actually decisions been made in a broader review of the system. We identified, I believe, 6 sites getting additional seats, either new or expansion of dialysis that we've announced over the last couple of years. Work is well underway on many of these. Others are at different stages of design. In combination, I believe it's somewhere over 40 additional seats added to the province for dialysis patients. That's going to reduce the travel time for many, reduce the pressure in some other communities and existing sites. So, Mr. Speaker, we need to get those rolled out and then reevaluate our overall dialysis system.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question also is for the Minister of Health today. On September the 21st, the House heard me talk about Mr. Reg Edwards. I did submit a form on his behalf as well, and the difficulties that Mr. Edwards is having assessing medical attention. At that time, the minister responded that day by saying, for individuals like the constituent referenced who may have trouble traveling outside of their home environment, our physicians can now provide care through phone communication through the My Health NS website, a secure portal to provide that service. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Edwards is a senior who isn't really up on the technologies. He doesn't have a computer or a smartphone, so he can't access My Health Nova Scotia. So does the minister have a solution for patients with serious health concerns who are orphaned by lack of doctors and, similar to Mr. Edwards, do not have reasonable access to My Health NS?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify my previous remarks, in the compensation opportunities and the changes that we made in the agreement with Doctors Nova Scotia last March, about 8 months ago now, I guess, was not for smartphone access to provide care, but indeed traditional telephone. Really, it's in that non-face-to-face space. So traditional telephone consults that can take place, as well as communication through the My Health NS technology.
The honourable member for Sackville Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you, Minister. So, as Mr. Edwards' medication currently needs to be refilled, it needs to be refilled regularly. He did have the pharmacist extend his prescription for 30 days that they were allowed to do, but yet this is just really pushing the problem down the road for Mr. Edwards. Like many seniors, like Mr. Edwards, are finding after years of contributing into this province that they now need the help of the provincial medical system the most, and they don't have access to it. Mr. Minister, could you please tell Mr. Edwards and others like him how to get proper services they deserve instead of waiting on an 811 system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, the province continues with its investments to improve access to primary care for all Nova Scotians, including the members' constituents, but all Nova Scotians. We recognize and have heard from frontline healthcare providers that our healthcare systems are shifting the way that individuals provide the best care is in a collaborative environment, Mr. Speaker. We are supporting and investing in collaborative practices. Indeed, in January, when the Nova Scotia Health Authority put out a request for submissions of proposals to work in or expand collaborative practices, they had over 100 submissions, Mr. Speaker, by over 400 physicians. That represents about Order,
please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
So the interest, Mr. Speaker, of our frontline healthcare providers in this type of service being provided is better service, Mr. Speaker, expanded service, and it's helpful in our recruitment and retention of physicians and other frontline healthcare workers, and that's what we're doing, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. A recent study suggests that in 30 years we could have more plastics in our ocean than fish. Mr. Speaker, we are a fishing and coastal province. We're on the front lines of this issue. We should be taking leadership on it. The federal government has committed to changing its own procurement practices to make sure that 75% of all its plastics are being reused and recycled. We should be doing the same thing here and using our government purchasing power to lead the change. So my question for the minister, will she commit today to set strong targets for reducing single-use plastics in our government operations?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for this question. This certainly has been topical, and we've been talking about it a lot the last few days. Single-use plastics are a problem. We all know that. They're in our waterways. They need to be dealt with. And Nova Scotians have been using innovative ways to not use the single-use plastics. We all have a role to play with this, whether it's using reusable bags or coming up with other innovation to use plastic. I recently heard about an entrepreneur in the local area who was making furniture out of plastics. I think we have a lot of ways to be able to reuse it or not use it, and I think Nova Scotians are playing their part in this. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Well, I have to agree with the minister. Yes, Nova Scotians have been using innovative ways, but what about the government? Residents in Lunenburg have formed Plastic-Free Lunenburg. They're working with businesses and consumers to reduce the use of single-use plastics. Businesses like the Savvy Sailor and the Point General have already made big changes. They are an example to us. But as experts point out, we could be implementing policies for extended producer responsibility. We already have it for electronics. It's very simple. If you profit from manufacturing it, then you need to be responsible for recycling it. How hard can it be? So my question for the minister is this: when can we expect to see leadership from her government by way of policies that will tackle single-use plastics in this province?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for that other question. Certainly, I mean, we know that this is a problem. We know it's going, but I think it's becoming less and less. People are more responsible. They are recycling. They're actively recycling. And I'm happy to report that none of the recycled plastic that is collected in Nova Scotia has ever gone into a Nova Scotia landfill. It is being sold and being dealt with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And my question through you is to the Minister TIR. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year I had the pleasure of having the company of the Minister as we toured the wonderful constituencies of Sydney River Myra Lewisburg. And during that tour, of course, the Minister was able to see firsthand some of the challenges that the residents of that community face. With the implementation and planning for the 5-year plan coming up, and the Minister of Finance is always telling us about the surpluses she's able to maintain, I'm wondering if the Minister could give me an update on where we are with the Myra Gut Bridge.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister, the member opposite, for the question. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the great people of Gaborone for accepting one of the pilot projects for our off-road vehicle program, which is turning out to be very well received. The Myra Bridge. The Myra Bridge is in design, and we're very close to finishing the design and putting it out for tender.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
I really appreciate that answer, and I want to clarify that, of course, the pilot project that we got in Gaborone was actually meant to be in the Myra Gut area, but there's no bridge for them to go across. So, Mr. Speaker, that being said, the people of Gaborone were very happy to have the pilot project. The only Tory constituency to get one anywhere is in the province of Nova Scotia, and that's been pointed out by my colleagues on Member-Kenshin. But the real question, Mr. Speaker, the real question at this point and time, and it's one that I have asked since I've been coming to this House, is the New Boston Road. The residents of the New Boston Road over the course of the last little while have indeed seen some pavement on an end of the highway where there is a huge hill and there's some traffic concerns for students who are travelling by bus. They are telling me that if they had just 0.4 more kilometres, they would be very happy for this year. So I'm just wondering if the Minister would have some consideration, because I did take him on that road as well, on the New Boston Road, 0.4 kilometres, pavement.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure him, even though he could not get Premier Macdonald to pay attention to this road, I will take this under advisement and go talk to Mr.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Environment. This past summer, many days saw large numbers of people again visit Carter's Beach because of its natural beauty and power of social media. When a large number of people arrive at the same time without proper parking, washroom and refuse facilities, it creates a problem for everyone. Last week, I inquired about the Minister's Department's infrastructure plans for one of the province's most spectacular beaches. I tabled a photo to show how ineffective the pack-in, pack-out program was, and was told by the Minister of Community Culture and Heritage it takes a while to educate people on the program. My question to the Minister is, can she please tell this House when Carter's Beach will have the permanent infrastructure required like other beaches in this province?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to report to the beach that I too was one of the people that went to Carter's Beach this summer. I have to agree. It's a beautiful beach. I was absolutely blown away by the beauty and also by the cleanliness. I had visited that day about 6 or 8 beaches in the area. All of them were pack-in, pack-out programs. I think I saw one piece of litter in all those beaches that day. So, you know, we have already put out, there are porta-pot toilets on the site. There are not garbage cans on the site, and to date, we're not going to be putting garbage cans in. They aren't really effective. People empty their garbage in it, the birds get in it, they go. The pack-in, pack-out is working for Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Well, sadly, Mr. Speaker, the residents that live on that road wouldn't agree with that statement. For nearby residents, the government's inaction has led to many headaches over the last few years as they struggle to go retrieve their mail, get out of their driveways, and even keep their properties clean. When I raised the issue last week, the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage suggested that people park and walk from Somerville Beach Provincial Park to Carter's, and that people are taking shorter walks on the beach and not spending the entire day. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't disagree more. This beach has become a destination, and it would be quite a hike from Somerville Beach Park to Carter's, especially for many seniors. It's a 10-kilometre walk. We need to strike the right balance between residents, beachgoers, and protecting the ecosystem of the area. So my question to the minister is, will she commit to working with the region of Queens to address the serious parking and safety concerns of my constituents?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Yeah, thank the honourable member for that question. She absolutely has a point. We noted too that day it was very hard to get in, very hard to get out. Emergency vehicles are going to, you have to, you know, in theory it's nice to say we need to protect our dunes, and we do, absolutely. They have to be identified and protected. We have to make sure that there isn't any garbage, that people do pack in and out. We have to make sure that there's washroom facilities so people aren't using the dunes, and the parking is a problem. We have to make sure emergency vehicles can get in there. I absolutely will meet with the people of the area and try to come to some solution. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. This summer, I had a constituent who had applied for a grant through Housing Nova Scotia. When they calculated his annual income, he was confused, because Housing Nova Scotia includes the caregiver benefit as income, but the Department of Health does not. The inconsistency in policies prevents some Nova Scotians from getting the help they need. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, I'm asking about policy, not the housing client. So my question for the minister is this: will Housing Nova Scotia update its policies so they align with those of the Department of Health in calculating annual income? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank the honourable member for the question. And in fact, this is an issue that we have indeed have been looking at. And as soon as, I don't know whether it will be lined up with the Department of Health or whether it will be lined up with the Department of Community Services, but we are looking to make sure that there is consistency across the programs that we deliver. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, the government has indicated that it wants to encourage Nova Scotians to stay in their homes as long as possible. Grants through Housing Nova Scotia are meant to help people on a fixed income provide necessary updates to their homes. Unfortunately, differing policies from department to department have left many confused and frustrated. And again, not speaking to a specific case, but the policy framework, my question is this: are regular reviews being conducted at community services to ensure that these sorts of policy discrepancies don't impact the living conditions of applicants? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I don't know about whether they've been done in the past, but I can tell you that we do them now. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Energy and Mines. Earlier this week, a new poll came out that showed Nova Scotians are split around the drilling BP does off our coast. 54% oppose it, 46% support it. But there's one thing, Mr. Speaker, that both sides agree with. 90% of those interviewed, Mr. Speaker, said that capping stack should be within hand within about a 24-hour period. Mr. Speaker, that kind of consensus should send a message to the government. Our coastal communities, our fishing industries, our tourist industry, and our marine environment deserves protection. So I'd like to ask the minister, what is the minister and the government doing to address the concerns that many Nova Scotians have about when it comes to the availability of a capping stack.
The Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question, and I agree. We have industries that have coexisted for generations. We have a very thriving fishing industry, and as well, we receive billions in royalties through our offshore to support schools and services that we provide. We have an offshore petroleum board that is the oversight. They are the regulator. I have full confidence in their ability to do that work, and we will continue to work with them closely as we continue to promote both our fishing industry and as well as our offshore exploration.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The town of Mahone Bay, the town of Lunenburg, the municipality of Shelburne have all written to the federal minister about concerns with the Canada Offshore Petroleum Board and around the process of approval, Mr. Speaker. They want stricter regulations. So I'd like to ask the minister, what is the minister doing to ensure that towns like Mahone Bay and Lunenburg and others who have concerns about their coastal industry, fishing industries, what is the minister doing to ensure that the federal government hears their concerns, Mr. Speaker?
Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. Again, I have great faith in the Offshore Petroleum Board and the regulatory role that they play. We keep a very close relationship with all of our communities across the province. I've had the opportunity in my previous role to go down and visit those municipalities and hear those concerns and conversations. I believe that for generations, our industry...
Please, time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.